What's up, y'all, and welcome to the Ideaspace. I'm Yancey Strickler. Few people living today have as much influence on how the world runs as the author, economist, and professor Mariana Mazzucato. Ever since her first book, The Entrepreneurial State, Mazzucato has carved out a distinct path in economics and public service. It's one of those rare books that completely changes how you see the world. After reading it, you won't look at an iPhone or a prescription drug the same way again. Her second book, The Value of Everything, methodically pokes holes in our assumptions that financial value should be the one form of value for everything. And her brand new book, Mission Economy, explores how to create value and innovation by closely looking at the Apollo moon landing in the 1960s as a case study for what happens when governments set bold, ambitious policies that require widespread collaboration to solve them. Missions like these, she argues, can transform society and produce enormous amounts of spillover value that all of society shares. The Apollo mission ultimately produced the internet, software development, camera phones, tennis shoes, and a dozen plus other key inventions as the unexpected side effects of the larger mission. Today, Mariana is one of the busiest people in the world. In addition to founding and leading the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in London, Mariana advises everyone from AOC to the Mayor of London to the Prime Ministers of Italy and South Africa on how to reinvigorate government and create value and innovation in their societies. Few people have influenced my thinking as much as Mariana, which is why I'm so excited to welcome her to the Ideaspace to discuss her work, theories of value, and how it feels to push so hard against the grain. The new book is fantastic. Your best book yet.
Really?
Yeah, I really, the way it ties together the past research and lays forward like a plan and a plan that feels very much right for the moment. You know, it really feels like this is the time for these ideas. And swear to God, I literally pumped my fist in the air after reading the last chapter and the last sentence about like taking the fight. And it's just very well done. And, you know, I'm just very impressed.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so nice. Cause I almost want to cry, you know, like with Meghan Markle, when they asked her, how are you? And she's like, ah, because actually, you know, I get a lot of hate. I mean, when you're sort of, you know, academics are always supposed to be kind of objective, you know, pros and cons and everything kind of averages out. You're not supposed to really express an opinion. So for a long time, I've actually been calling out, you know, the Pfizers of the world. Pfizer is one of the most financialized companies, by the way, in the world. And so you get the kind of, you know, resistance on that side. But also within, you know, progressives, it's funny, like, you know, when you're kind of just saying things how they are, you open yourself up to quite a bit of attack. And also if you're having influence, you know, if people are actually listening to you, the attack is stronger. If no one's listening to you, who cares what you say? You can say whatever the hell you want, you know? And so recently I've been a bit like, oh God, not again, in terms of like the bogus attack. So thank you for saying you like the book.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that my opinion, Entrepreneurial State and Value of Everything, you know, both books that heavily influenced my thinking, but you know, I feel like Mission Economy goes kind of a step farther and is not just you as a policy analyst and economist sort of breaking things down, but you're sort of trying to put things back together again, maybe. And so I found that to be just an ingredient maybe I didn't know I was looking for in the previous books. But especially towards the end, the last few chapters, I thought it was great, just the things you lay out. But I think of you, and I think it's fair to say, as one of the most influential people in the world. You're named to this UN High-Level Advisors Board on Economic and Social Affairs. You're the co-chair of this World Health Organization board of all women. That's looking at.
We haven't told anyone that yet, but good. I'm glad you.
I heard you mention that to Kara Swisher the other day.
Yeah, exactly. And I told her that too. I'm like, you're the only one who knows.
You're just me and Kara. You're advising heads of state and national and local governments, and you know the Pope got indie cred for name dropping you in his book. So, why are the most powerful people in the world coming to you, and how closely does the message in Mission Economy track with the kinds of conversations you're having?
Maybe I'll start with the second one, which is the reason I wrote the book. Was I was feeling there was, a real thirst already for the kind of last 10 years that I've been, writing the Entrepreneurial State and the book on value around the ideas, but then the how, what does this actually mean for the nitty gritty, procurement design and the redesign of industrial strategy away from just a list of sectors towards this kind of purpose driven approach where all sorts of different sectors get involved. That kind of how is the reason I wrote it, but also the hope. It's actually a pretty positive story, isn't it? I mean, especially in a world now with so much polarization at every level, and distrust, just kind of that hope that actually we can do better. We got, humans on the moon and back again when we treated it as an urgent problem. What if we actually treat as urgent as a security risk even, or social problems, and treat it though also with the same level of boldness, creativity, and inspiration, but also intersectoral investment and innovation that we had when we went to the moon, even though these social problems are so much harder. But anyway, so that kind of hope that we can do better. And it's going to be also fun, potentially, just bringing lots of different voices to the table in terms of that kind of co-creation, co-design side, which is what I was just talking about a couple minutes ago with the London mayor, because we're helping London, but also specifically Camden Council, which is a part of London where I work, to kind of nest this idea of a mission, purpose-driven approach and how a council or city, thinks about itself. What does it mean to bring housing associations and different types of citizen groups to the table and actually asking, how do we want to live together? So it's not just kind of a future mobility plan, that you kind of feed in this top-down way. The citizens saying, this is good for you, you need a green transition, you need a carbon neutral city, but actually let's talk about it. And, it might be a debate, there might be contestation along the way, but we can actually design, bringing that concept of design also to the table, a better way of living. And it's going to be hard. It means really unpicking all the problems right now in terms of how we come together, or when we don't come together, or when we don't listen to each other. I don't think civil servants, by the way, are trained in listening, and yet you should be listening, right? If that's why you're there, to serve, the public. So empathy 101 classes wouldn't be bad. And I don't mean that they're not empathetic, but literally empathy in the serious notion of the word, which is listening, putting yourself in other people's shoes, understanding, so that social movements, whether it's, Fridays for the Future, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, these are all movements, just like the trade union movement in the past, or also in the present, but anyway, that can really shape markets. They can help shape an economy. But that means allowing them to really be at the table and asking really fundamental questions. Anyway, so I think there's a thirst. I mean, coming back to your question, sorry, I'm a bit ranting, but there's a thirst for the idea, but the book was really, as you said, almost like a recipe book. Like, okay, let's unpick what this is going to mean for how we confront, for example, the SDGs. So it's not just this kind of tokenistic, fluffy.
And the thirst is for tell us how to revitalize our state. Tell us, help us feel passion, connect us to a purpose. Like what is that thirst for?
The thirst is to put yourself in the driver's seat, like, just feeling miserable when at best you're a cheerleader. I used to joke that I would walk into meetings with civil servants as an economist, and I'd walk out as a life coach, because this idea that actually the point of policy is not just about fixing markets, but actively co-creating and co-shaping, and you can be purpose and mission driven. That requires taking risks, being an investor of first resort, not a lender of last resort, not de-risking, but again, sharing risks and rewards. All that is a new narrative. It's a new story. And it's quite invigorating, isn't it? It's like, oh, okay, fine. I'm not here just to, facilitate Elon Musk so he can do great things. Actually, we need entrepreneurialism within the civil service, but also capabilities, capacity. And what's so interesting about the COVID period, if one can use the word interesting with such a tragic situation, but what's interesting is there's been such different experience globally and how countries have handled it. And some of the countries even, that are in the developing world that have done quite well are ones like Vietnam or Kerala and India that have actually been making over the last decade serious investments within public administration. So in order to be a good partner with business, right? Because it's never about just the state or just business. It's always going to be a partnership. But whereas we have, business schools talking and thinking with business about how to create value, we don't use, value creation, wealth creators in the context of the civil service and the public service and the state. So I think there's a thirst for that after being kind of depressed with the opposite narrative. I actually opened up The Entrepreneurial State back in 2013, the book, with a quote by David Cameron, who said, "Civil servants are the enemies of enterprise." Like, well, that's come back to bite. Because the way to really dismantle the state is not so much necessarily to defund it, because money comes and goes. You can increase a budget, but to really kind of demolish its sense of confidence and the kind of organizational structure. And I think that's what's actually happened over the last half century.
So in Entrepreneurial State, you showed how much of Silicon Valley began through publicly funded research. You demonstrate every part of the iPhone originated in that kind of way. The same is true of a lot of pharmaceuticals, and that goods were created through public research and they're now sold to us on the private market. So that was published about a decade ago. And, the first time I read it, I was shocked. The idea that not only did the iPhone kind of originate through public research projects, but that Apple had gotten a loan, a federal loan early on in their life. This was like completely unknown to me. And I was someone that was working in tech, and that changed how I saw the role of the state. So what led you to write Entrepreneurial State? How did that start?
So that began, I actually wrote it. It's very odd, actually, what I did. I wrote it as a pamphlet first in 2011. I teamed up with Demos, a think tank here in London. And the agreement was that, because normally they have to find funding for things. I was like, no, I need to write this urgently. So I said, I'll fund it through some overheads that I had for a big grant that I had received. I said, all I want you to do is just post it, like literally get an envelope. Well, first of all, print it. So they handled most of the printing. And then post it to every policymaker that you know in the world. And it was free on the web, right? It was, literally open source. It still is, which is not a good idea to write a book to have a different version of it completely free. But the book version is a much more expanded version, which I ended up later writing in 2013. But the reason I wrote that 2011 version, really in a rush, it was quite tragic because my mother also died during the period I was reading it. So it was really, really actually hard to write. But I wrote it in a rush because I felt that what Britain, but much of Europe was experiencing, in some ways less so in the US, was all this austerity after the financial crisis to reduce public budgets, very much, again, what is being talked about now, because we've put in all this money because of COVID relief. And, there's all this talk about, we're going to have to tighten the belt later. So, that happened with the financial crisis. A lot of relief came in right away. And then immediately, we got to cut the deficit, debt. But the narrative wasn't just, we need to pay back all this money that we spent. It was, this is going to be good for innovation. It's good for competitiveness, especially in Europe, where they were asking the age-old question, why does the US have Google, and Amazon and Apple, and we don't? And their answer was always, they have venture capital. We have great science at Oxford and Cambridge. We just don't have enough venture capital. I was like, all right, let's unpick this a bit. You're cutting the public budget in the name of innovation, saying you're going to do that in order to be competitive, to have the Googles. Well, guess what? Guess who funded Google's algorithm? Uncle Sam. Guess who funded Tesla's early investments? Uncle Sam. Guess who funded everything that makes our smart products smart and not stupid? Internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, and so on. The taxpayer. So, and it wasn't just to say, look, the state is great, it funds all this stuff. It was, just step back. And if we really want to have that innovation-led, growth that so many countries starve for, you need to better understand where innovation comes from. And of course, it is critical to talk about the private sector, but we know that. That story is out there. I don't have to tell that story. But the role of the public sector at best is talked about as, again, fixing markets, or, people like Bill Gates, unlike Peter Thiel, who goes on the opposite story. But Bill Gates sensibly says things like, we need, more public research, publicly funded research, because, he admits that he and Steve Jobs and others completely depended on that. That's true, but it wasn't even just, basic research. It was also applied research. The ARPA, DARPA model is a lot about the applied side. It's also about patient, long-term strategic finance. Countries like Israel have had public venture capital funds like YOSMA that provided patient, not inpatient capital. So yes, venture capital is important, but often the VC sector is exit driven. They want to exit quickly. relatively quickly in terms of the long, lags that innovation has through an IPO or a buyout. And that rush to exit has actually caused a lot of damage in some sectors like biotechnology, where I've written about this with Bill Lazonic, where we've ended up with lots of PLIPOs, productless IPOs, because of that rush. So science-based sectors need time, right? So that patient long-term finance has often come from public sector through also programs like the SBIR program in the United States that basically is public finance through procurement. So every department needs about 3% of its budget, whether it's Department of Health, Environment, Defense, to go to SMEs, not because they're SMEs, but because they're procuring in innovative solutions for that department. Anyway, and also, even further downstream, bold demand side policies. So my colleague Carlota Perez argues, for example, that without suburbanization, the mass production revolution, which was a huge kind of technological and organizational revolution, wouldn't have had, its effect in the economy in terms of productivity increases, changes in production and distribution, because all these mass-produced products were then, going out to the suburbs to, dishwashers, washing machines, cars, and so on, and that helped to deploy and fully diffuse that. So that's also a lesson today. What are the demand side bold policies that we could have, for example, around a greener economy on the demand side that can really act as a funnel for that pull, even for the ICT revolution? Anyway, so the book, I wrote it both to kind of tell that innovation story, which I still think is just not known enough, but also to combat what at the time was really foolish austerity, which simply got countries into even worse of a mess. Forgetting Keynes's whole point that when you're experiencing a crisis, the last thing you want to do when you're government is to do the same thing that consumers and businesses are doing, which is to spend and invest less, because otherwise, a recession will turn into a depression. And also it caused huge, uncertainty. It caused, in people's lives, inequality. The kind of knife crime epidemic that we're witnessing right now in London is very much on the back of a very long, austerity period we've had here, where youth centers have been cut, mental health support has been cut, the police have been cut. That's just brought misery in the name of innovation.
As you were writing or putting that out, first the pamphlet and the book, were you anxious? Were you nervous? Did you feel like you're coming in with the opposite message that everyone's saying? Did you feel confident doing that, or did you feel uncertain?
Yeah, that's just not a feature of I'm sure I have lots of faults. And my kids will tell you many, but insecurity and lack of confidence isn't one of them. Not because I think I'm arrogant or something, but I just don't think about it. I just don't think of what other people are going to think about it. I just think this is going to be important, and it is important. And it's important also to realize you're not alone. You need to work with others in order to get the message across, which includes, by the way, good media, like now yourself with a good podcast series, but, being also willing to go on the media. That maybe sometimes at the beginning brought me nervousness because I wasn't used to that. But, going on the news at 10:30 at night, which is one of the best talk shows here or news shows, which is called BBC Newsnight. Yeah, it's great and thrilling in the beginning, but it's also extremely tiring. I'd rather be at home putting my kids to bed or just getting a good night's sleep. But that, I think I felt it more like a fight, like kind of guerrilla warfare. So you kind of build up your adrenaline to do it, so even though it might be easier just to do, research, and in the end to say, oh, and here's the policy implications of my research. It's kind of the typical academic way, which is what I used to do. Being kind of on the front line, repeating your message also. My dad used to say, you're always saying the same thing. I'm like, yeah, but it's to different people, Dad. It's okay. But, saying it to different types of policymakers, different levels of government, again, local, city, regional, national, international, and also having the patience also with the team that I've been building in my new institute to then work with policymakers. I think that's maybe also where a lot of the both adrenaline but also happiness comes from, because when you're working with people and getting your hands dirty, it's always going to be actually quite enriching, because in general people are nice, I think, especially those who go into the public service. And instead of just saying, hey, don't do austerity, invest, interest rates are low, well, that's not enough. How are you going to do it? So working with policymakers, building a new public bank in Scotland, or redesigning industrial strategy to, again, be problem focused, not sector specific, redesigning innovation policy with the European Commission, but also now working at that city level with different mayors. That's, quite thrilling, but it also needs to be, coming back to that concept of empathy, you need to be listening as much as you're talking, right? So in the institute, called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, that I've set up here in London as part of University College London, we call it practice-based theorizing. So you might have a great theory of something like, you need more patient long-term finance, public banks, or wealth funds. Fine, great idea. Then you go on the ground and start working on it, whether it's with the state of California, or if it's, rethinking public banks in South Africa and so on. And you realize, actually, this is much, much harder than we thought. And bringing back that experience, the learning on the ground, to the theory and back again, that kind of feedback between theory and practice is important. And unfortunately, I don't think that's how universities work. I don't think that's how academics work. And I really think part of our job is to also rethink the university, rethink what it means to be an academic, in order to really engage in that kind of ground level way, as well as, big ideas. Of course, we need blue sky thinking, but then bring it to the ground, learn from it, and bring it back to the theory.
Matt, the new book, Mission Economy, is all about missions. And I really appreciate how you talk about how sort of attention of the mission is that they will often be top down. The PM, the CEO, whoever dictates, here's what it's going to be, and people are just expected to follow. And what you talk about is, we're in a different era where there is actual dialogue and where there is the potential for engagement. And you highlighted a couple interesting ways that in the EU that sort of citizens are being queried more, that there's more of a conversation, more of a dialogue. What is that space that's happening?
Sure. I mean, first, what I mean by missions, and I think this is just important for kind of definitions because people might mean different things. What I mean by a mission-oriented approach is one that, again, is kind of bold and inspirational, but really does also get lots of different actors together. And the reason I say that is it's not about like one big project, big offshore wind plant. That's the mission. No, the mission is kind of a proper green transition with a very, particular target around it, whether it's having a carbon neutral city by, say, 2030, and then getting all sorts of different sectors, from real estate to mobility, food, the social sector, construction, and so on, to work together to deliver that. So, missions really, in terms of picking the willing, not picking winners, and that kind of, old style thinking of what it means to have active government policy. And so that question of who decides what the mission is really what you're asking, right? Is it just like a minister or an academic like myself going into a country advising, saying, oh, you should do that? And I think the answer is no, especially if we're talking about societal missions like those that are embedded within the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So I begin with the moon landing because I think there's so many interesting lessons there. But then when I talk about today's social problems, from inequality to issues around health and climate change, we can't, it's not a cut and paste job in terms of the Apollo project. However, I think it's important to first say what we can learn from Apollo before we bring it to be this more dynamic, again, citizen-centered focus. And what we can learn from Apollo is how business worked with government in a much more symbiotic way than I think we have today. NASA, first of all, it wasn't just aeronautics. It was lots of different sectors, from nutrition, materials, electronics. Of course, the whole software industry, one could argue, came out of that. But what fascinated me was how the head of procurement in NASA had a clause of no excess profits. We're not going to turn this into a gambling casino. We're going to work together, and you're not going to just, charge whatever you want to NASA. And so they really took care in designing, again, procurement away from what it had been, which was this cost plus model where costs were being inflated and also quality wasn't very high, to a fixed price model of procurement with constant incentives for innovation and quality improvement. So it was kind of retaining costs down, but you got, bonuses if you want when you did great things. And so that kind of confidence that NASA had in terms of how it was partnering with business, and the dynamic capabilities that NASA knew that it required in order not to get captured by what they called, in quotes, brochuremanship. I love that. It's kind of like today's PowerPoints. Fancy a private sector person goes into government. Oh, listen to me. I'm really smart. Yeah, here's my PowerPoint. So they called it Burr Sherman shit because they didn't have PowerPoints back then. But that's such an interesting insight. And it's something I've been kind of stressing for a long time with governments, which is you yourself need to be capable in order to partner in an intelligent, strategic way with business. Of course, business knows it's a value creator, so it makes those investments. If you don't, as a government, have agencies that are investing within their own public administration, you're not going to do very well, and you're going to partner in problematic ways, and you will get captured. Anyway, so that's an important lesson. In terms of, again, that who decides the mission, of course, the Apollo program was quite top down, whereas today's climate change missions, for example, the work we're doing in London is nesting that within, the social housing estates, bringing housing associations to the table, different citizens who are living in social housing, talking together about how do we want to live together, and kind of using that also in terms of that design ex ante of the mission itself. They're not just reacting to it afterwards. Similarly, trade unions, we should remember the labor share of global income is at a record low level. There's no problem right now with profits. There's really a problem with investment. I wrote about that with my other book on value, and that kind of value extraction, which you also talk about, of course, in your work, Yancy. That itself has not helped workers because people are not being invested in terms of, skills, and jobs are not actually reappearing when so much value is extracted out, for example, through share buybacks. Getting workers' voices to the table, not just reacting to, a dysfunctional capitalism, but being part of the planning of a better capitalism means bringing workers' voices to the table to design also the missions, right? So there's this concept of the just transition globally. Well, fine, but it shouldn't just be about saying these transitions need to be just. What we even mean by a green transition should have different voices. And one of the interesting missions that we've been engaging with in Sweden is one that looks at school meals. Because Sweden has this really interesting high-level mission of having a fossil-free welfare state, and then it's landing in kind of specific places, including schools. And so having tasty, sustainable, healthy school meals, who's going to design that? Well, who better than having children involved in thinking about, also the whole food chain in their curriculum, but also monitoring whether these school meals are good or not very good, good tasting. That's going to be part of that process of knowing also when to pivot. DARPA, of course, which is a famous organization in the US government for having come up not only with the internet, with lots of things, including, I think, self-driving cars more recently. DARPA's organizational structure is often talked about, but it's not only good at turning the tap on in terms of what to invest in innovation, but also when to turn the tap off. When missions aren't working, what do? You don't just stick with it because it was someone's great idea. You pivot. You have to be flexible and agile. And so again, all these are about organizational culture, and we don't have agile, flexible, dynamic, creative bureaucracies. And we need them if we're going to fight any of the global challenges we currently are facing.
So along these lines, in mission economy, you return several times to the idea of collective value creation. There's one part, quoting one part you write, the dominant economic framework rests on the assumption that people maximize their own preferences. Collective effort is missed because only individual decisions matter, with firms maximizing profits and consumers maximizing utility, a proxy for happiness. In this context, the concept of social value is limited to the aggregation of individuals making decisions to maximize their own economic welfare. So, what do we miss when we only see value as being created or held at the individual level? Like, what's the other way to see value creation?
So that's actually the key kind of point that I made in the book, The Value of Everything, where I unpick different value theories and argue that today's value theory that's taught in every economics class globally, kind of Econ 101, first of all, we only look at business really as a value creator, but also value is basically an outcome of how all these different individuals are making their decisions. They're maximizing their individual kind of preference, right? So again, workers maximizing choices of leisure versus work, consumers, utility, and so on. And then we aggregate those behaviors and draw, our fancy supply and demand curves, which even people who haven't taken an economics class will know what that looks. It's an X, and in the middle, there's an equilibrium price. And in economics, we learned that these equilibrium prices also then reveal value, right? So they actually reverse, just like with the flick of the wand, or whatever the expression is, a century or so of economic thinking, which had done the opposite. So the classical economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, began with fundamental questions of what is value, who's producing value. So both Smith and Marx talked a lot about, for example, the problems with landlords at the time who were extracting value out of the system, similarly to today, how many people might argue that hedge funds and a lot of the private equity industry and financial sector is kind of extracting value, not necessarily creating it. And I know that's kind of a broad brush comment. We can maybe go back to that. But anyway, they were interested, like they had an objective theory of value, not a subjective one. Subjective meaning everyone's just doing their own kind of individual preferences. They had an objective one, not in the sense that it was deterministic, but in the sense they actually looked at production. Who's doing what? And who's earning what from that. And so, that's also why Adam Smith really cared about things like productivity. He was looking at the pin factory at the time and looked at how much more productive pin making could be if there was a greater division of labor, in production, and looking at that organizational and technological change, which he thought was fundamental to increasing growth and the wealth of nations, the title of his great book. When you move to a completely subjective theory, you end up being much less capable to even distinguish things like profits from rents, right? So profits, one could argue, in terms of how the classicals were looking at it, can be seen as an income derived from capital of creating sort of a new good and service. Rent is just moving around existing kind of assets and charging people for it, like a troll under a bridge, pay me to be able to cross the bridge. So all the fees, the immense fees in the financial intermediation kind of sector could be seen as rent. And yet simply because there's a price being charged for something, we then include that in GDP and call it something like, oh, that's a service for financial intermediation or a service for risk taking, if we look at the investment banks. Anyway, so when we completely get confused between value and prices, and value extraction and value creation are the same thing, as long as they both have a fee or price attached to it, because that's all we're looking at, prices, and getting them confused with value, then we get ourselves in a huge mess. And by the way, Mark Carney read my book, and his Reith lectures, his first one at least, is quite, he said this in his first Reith lecture. He talked about that, and he brought to it also his amazing experience then as heading up the Bank of England. The lessons also he learned in terms of it's very hard to redesign or re-steer a financial system when we're confusing, what's valuable. But also the public sector itself as creating value, but also being a value creator. That's really hard to do when we don't know how to measure the outcomes, say, of a well-designed public health service. In the United Kingdom, where I live, I've been here 20 years, we don't pay a penny, by the way, for health, a penny, as long as you're a citizen here. Also, regardless of whether you're working or not, you get access to a very good public health system. We know how to value the costs of that, costs of nurses, costs of doctors, costs of the hospital. That goes into GDP. We still haven't managed to include into GDP the value that's actually created on whether, like all the good stuff that comes about from having a well-functioning public education system, public health system, when it's free. And if you think about how we determine productivity, output per input, if we only know the price of the input, not the price of the output, it's going to be also hard to even talk about things like productivity of the health service. And there's all sorts of ways people try to get around that. Whereas you have Lloyd Blankfein, the head of Goldman Sachs, 1 year after the financial crisis, saying, without trying to make people laugh, he was serious, saying that Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. And you could laugh, but he's right. In terms of how we measure value, yeah, they're earning a hell of a lot of money. And if we're confusing incomes, prices, and value, of course they're most productive in the world. So if we want to re-steer our economy to be more inclusive, sustainable, less financialized, more investment driven, et cetera, it has to go down also to first principles of this sort.
Yeah, so I mean, this is the core idea of The Value of Everything, which is a fantastic book, and about this confusion of price and value. And I'm curious about your instincts for addressing this. Like, seems like there's one project I see a lot in the environmental movement of like, not in the environmental movement, but in areas of climate of let's put prices on everything. Like, let's convert forests to dollars so that we can account for the whole world. It all goes on the ledger. There's maybe another potential response, which is creating new forms of value that price must compete with or that add to how we think about price. How do you think about, you know, trying to square this circle of this gap between price and value?
So it sort of depends at what level of analysis. So there's sort a micro, a meso, and a macro kind of level, right? So there's been lots of discussion how at the macro level we need, for example, alternative measures to GDP, precisely because of the reasons I was mentioning. If we only include things with prices, then when you marry your babysitter, GDP will go down. When we pollute, GDP will go up. Right? I'm sort of joking, but not really. Confusing again price with value. All these weird things happen, which feminists have been talking about for a long time. Feminist economists have been talking for a long time, as well as environmental economists. With those two examples are perfect ones. I mean, care. Now that we're calling all these frontline workers, care workers, essential workers, and yet we're using the word essential and still don't know how to value them. It's a real insult, right? Instead of clapping, healthcare workers, we should at least, not only value them, but also pay them properly for that value. The problem is, though, if we focus too much on the price bit, you also get into policies which at best try to correct for those price dysfunctions. So, for example, you might have people argue that we need, carbon taxes, which, make companies basically actually cost the pollution that they're creating. As important as that is, the over focus, say, on incentives, thinking that you can correct the system just getting the prices right, creates another dysfunction, that we forget that broader point that I was making before with the entrepreneurial state idea, which is actually there's a huge kind of portfolio of different policies we need, of which one surely should be, let's make sure we actually get the prices right. But that's definitely not going to be enough. We would have never gotten the internet revolution, the nanotech revolution, the green revolution, the whole space tech revolution had it just been about incentives and getting the prices right. It required vision, a mission, and so on. So but also there's lots of discussions also within companies. I mean, that's sort of at that micro level, how companies behave, and this idea that we also need different types of corporate governance away from just focusing on another type of price, which is share price, towards a broader notion of stakeholder value. So the Business Roundtable wrote that letter 2 years ago in the New York Times about it. Larry Fink the year before from BlackRock saying, oh, we've kind of screwed up. We need to be maximizing this broader notion of value, and then nothing changes. The problem there is that if we try to change things just within one of the actors in the system, why? Because we continue to pretend they're the only value creators. Most of the people that talk about stakeholder value in the same sentence will say business creates value. Business is the wealth creator. We need to make sure that value is shared more broadly. It was like, no, hold on, back up. Wrong. Business is one of the key value creators, of course, but so are these other actors in the system. Again, that was the kind of point of the entrepreneurial state. So how do we share that value in this kind of pre-distribution way, in that ex ante way, through the initial recognition that we're actually collectively creating value? That is what, by the way, changes that confidence level we talked about before, but it also would create a different relationship, for example, between the public sector and the private sector, in terms also of how they negotiate. Coming back to that NASA example of no excess profits. Well, why? Not because it's unfair, but because actually, you're not the only one there, right? Boeing or Motorola or Honeywell, these companies that helped NASA get to the moon, they were part of this wider kind of social ecosystem. And that recognition of collective value creation needs to be nested then within the contracts, the relationships. Stakeholder value has to be at the center of the system, not just a corporate governance kind of discussion. And these are all parts of the answer to your question, right? You're not going to fix the system just getting the prices right. We need a host of all sorts of different types of policies, but also different relationships that recognize values being collectively created.
Over the last 10 years, a lot of the economic conversation on the left has focused on redistribution. But you mentioned something very different there, which is pre-distribution. Can you talk about what that is?
Yeah, I mean, pre-distribution is first of all, it's been used by different people, and I think that the way I've tried to use it is that it's doing the obvious, which is, making. Well, sorry, let me just back up a bit. Pre-distribution, let me just first define it, is the argument that in order to really tackle inequality, you can't just pick up the mess afterwards through redistributive policies, for example, through progressive taxation policies. Regressive taxation policy redistributes income from the poor to the rich. Progressive distributes it from the rich to the poor. Broadly speaking, we can go into exactly how that's done and why certain policies like VAT, when you increase that, that's regressive because it's penalizing people with lower incomes more than people with high incomes, and so on. So we need progressive taxation, but it's going to be really hard to fight inequality if you're always just doing it through tax, because that assumes that you allow, things to operate as they do, and then you fix it afterwards. Pre-distribution, the pre-bit means before, right? It means ex ante, not ex post. And that means that we need to get the relationships right in the first place. Right? So both relationships, like the public-private relationships in terms of how they are sharing the rewards, with that no excess profits clause that NASA had, but also with potentially equity stakes of governments in the kind of companies that they fund. Government in the US funded both Tesla and Solyndra, almost the same amount of money. It had to bail out the Solyndra loss, but didn't get any of the upside from the Tesla investment, which of course was high risk. For every successful Tesla investment, you will have 6 or 7 Solyndras. Talk to any VC, venture capitalist, they'll tell you that. But what Obama did was the opposite of a pre-distribution strategy. He said to Tesla, if you don't pay back the loan, and why wouldn't they pay back the loan? Because something goes wrong. We get 3 million shares in your company. Had he said, we get 3 million shares in your company, if you do pay back the loan, because it means you're successful and you will owe some of your gratitude to those that made it happen, the price per share between 2009 when they got it, 2013 when they paid it back, went from 9 to 90. That difference multiplied by 3 million would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment, right? So that kind of public venture capital investor first resort attitude would determine in a pre-distribution way how you think about not just the public investment, but also the sharing of the rewards. So you don't just have to redistribute afterwards, but also making sure that people are paid properly, the living wage. It's not rocket science. It's crazy that some of the richest companies in the world still don't do that. That's obviously a type of pre-distributive policy. But also, I think governing, the innovation system itself, which again is massively a collective, value creation enterprise, in a way that really is governed for the public good and the common good itself is pre-distributed. So pre-distributive. So making sure that you're not allowing patents to be abused, right? William Baumol, the late economist, used to talk about patents as causing unproductive entrepreneurship, not because patents in and of themselves are bad, but we've allowed them to be, used just for rent seeking. So they're often too wide, used for strategic reasons, too strong, so hard to license, too upstream. They used to be much more downstream, what was allowed to be patented. Now it's very upstream. So the tools for research are being patented. All that just creates a lot of value extraction. And the health sector is the worst. So today, for example, with the vaccine, making sure that it's not just a public-private investment program, which of course it has been hugely successful, but unless we govern the intellectual property rights, to really nurture the collective intelligence we now need. So as much of the vaccine knowledge is shared, but also making sure we don't allow, the dosages to be completely hoarded by certain countries, and making sure that we have things like a patent pool, which is what the World Health Organization has been arguing for. All of these things that I just mentioned could be parts of a pre-distributive kind of lens, which is get the governance of that collective value creation really to reflect public value and, make sure you're not getting kind of conned along the way. That means you'll have less inequality afterwards.
So if there's like some basic research happening now that's being funded through some grant, and say it goes on to produce a new web platform or a new pharmaceutical drug, 10, 15 years from now, how would you argue for that being structured differently than we've thought about those things in the past? Or is it just that we should be aware that these investments we're making are creating value? And, is it about realizing a financial return, or is it about like just realizing the value of this in general so that we're not starving ourselves of this investment?
So I think it requires different things. Thinking of it just as a financial return then brings us back to the initial problem, which is we become very short-sighted and just think about, what's the money that's going to be created, the economic value. Thinking about that too much ex ante doesn't get us those kind of moonshots, right? I mean, had we had a cost benefit analysis or net present value calculation of the Apollo program, it would have never begun, right? And this actually remind me, please, to mention something about the World Health Organization Council we're running, because that Health for All mission is really important in terms of how we think of the economics of it. But anyway, if we just think of it in terms of financial return, I think then it's a very narrow way to think about this bigger issue, which is really sharing both risks and rewards. There can definitely be measures which have to do with the financial return, like the example I just mentioned with equity stakes, that is a financial return. But the broader point of how do we govern the system for, a concept like the public good and the common good, that means paying attention to lots of different details, like governing the intellectual property rights or having conditionality that the profits that are outcomes of this collective value creation actually then get reinvested back into the system as opposed to extracted out through practices like share buybacks. Itself could be the way that you govern the system to get a public return for the public investment. And by the way, I often remind my colleagues that Bell Labs, which everyone knows about, hopefully, in the U.S., having been one of the most dynamic private sector R&D agencies inside at the time AT&T, came about because the government at the time basically forced AT&T, that in order to retain its monopoly profits and its monopoly status at the time, because it was a telecoms monopoly, they had to reinvest their profits back into the real economy, back into innovation, and big innovation beyond telecoms. Bell Labs was the answer. So, also the conditionality we're seeing now for the first time after many years with COVID, where in some countries the COVID recovery funds are conditional on companies transforming themselves. So in France, the recovery funds that went to both automotives and aerospace were conditional on those companies in those sectors committing to reducing their carbon emissions, or in Austria and Denmark, companies having to commit to not using tax havens in order to access the recovery funds, and so on. Those conditionalities are part of the way to make sure that companies that are benefiting from public subsidies, investments, guarantees are part of the solution, not part of the problem. Coming to your, concrete question, you could argue, because we would have to have very detailed policies. It's not just cut and paste across all sorts of different instruments. But with grants, for example, coming back to Google's algorithm funded by the NSF, you could think that maybe, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, and unfortunately for this, we'll need lawyers to figure this one out. But you could put into the contract, here's some money, Sergey Brin or whoever, it's yours, it's a grant. If it fails, don't worry. That's why we're funding you. We want to stimulate innovation, experimentation, and so on. But a clause, if this algorithm ends up, allowing you in a company built on, the patent from this to make, X billion in a certain amount of years or whatever, well, a percentage of those profits will go back into a public innovation fund. Why not? I don't know. And I'm just kind of, putting this out there. Surely it can be framed in a more intelligent way. We can think, but why not? And again, the guaranteed loans going to companies, which is different from basic R&D, which is a grant, but the guaranteed loans like the Tesla ones and the Solyndra ones, no reason why, because these are downstream investments, not the upstream ones where you hope that, there's also just lots of knowledge spillovers. The downstream ones that are going to particular companies to do particular things, again, that's where you might introduce the notion of equity stakes. But this assumption that the government, by putting in money in R&D, is going to create this great public good, it's simply not true. If you're then not governing that process, for example, governing the intellectual property rights in a particular way, because a patent is a contract, right? The government gives a company 20 years of monopoly power. So what does the government get back? Well, it gets back what it didn't have in the Middle Ages, where it was all just secrecy. In other words, when the patent is up, because it's been written down, literally, that's what a patent does. It writes down the kind of secret. Then, the patent is no longer there after 20 years. So there's more diffusion and knowledge spillovers in the economy. But if in the meantime, the patents have been allowed to be abused, they become part of the problem. The government doesn't get back its return in that deal because it's a contract. I don't like the word intellectual property rights. It makes it sound like it's a God-given right. No, it's a contract, and there's one party and another one, and there's a deal. How do you make that deal a good deal and a symbiotic deal and not a parasitic one? Well, you better make sure that the patent doesn't then get abused, because then you won't have diffusion, because you've allowed all the research to get privatized.
Mm. One thing I really appreciated in the book is, you see a lot of people expressing pessimism about the future, and these kids are so narcissistic, and there's all this individualism, et cetera, et cetera. And you sound more optimistic, and whereas voter participation rates in the U.S. were declining in the past, they're up now, and there's increased civic engagement. There's protest movements like the ones that you've mentioned, and it just, you can feel it. There's a different kind of spirit out there even before COVID. Do you think that we're moving into something after like classic 20th century individualism? Is something happening because of the network? If you think about, say, talking to AOC versus an older politician, or even thinking about your kids, like, is there some change in how we are relating?
Well, I think so. I mean, I have 4 kids, and they're so much more aware than I was at their age about all sorts of issues around inequality, race, the whole question of tolerance, more tolerant society. They're very aware of it. I sometimes say things that, they'll say I'm just completely unaware of the things that I should be saying, thinking, or doing, and they make me feel quite foolish. So, but that itself isn't enough, right? So that's where you can get kind of condescension, where we can be like, oh, isn't it cute? My teenagers know everything about climate change, and Greta gets patted on the head, at Davos or wherever. So in the same way that essential workers, key workers get clapped, on a Thursday, it's actually offensive, right? So what does it mean, coming back to this idea, and I don't want to sound like, this is all I believe in, this missions idea, but that's why I actually find the missions concept really hopeful and a positive concept, which is, what would it mean to actually bring those teenagers that have become really sensitive, for example, to climate change or to, Black Lives Matter, to the table when we talk about what needs to be done, right? In that co-design, co-creation way. And it's, I often remind people that the reason actually that teenagers, and even more young kids, kind of toddlers, know about one mission, global mission, which is a plastic-free ocean, is not because an academic like myself, or a great business leader like yourself, or a great minister talked about it and went into a classroom, but because there was this amazing documentary made by David Attenborough called Blue Planet, and that last episode, the whole series and everything he does is amazing, but that last episode of Blue Planet with all these baby dolphins choking and dying of plastic in their digestive system, that really resonated. So it spoke to them. So there's something about, what does it mean to bring the full power of the creative sector? And by that, I also mean poetry. If we think of the, Biden's inauguration, where that amazing poet just made everyone just like stop and think, oh my God, this is so powerful. So broadening out what we even mean when we're talking about, inspirational kind of moonshots, so that it's not even just the STEM subjects, science, technology, math, engineering, but also poetry and the humanities, and making people just feel again and dream again. And I have an interesting story. I actually ran a commission for the UK government around mission-oriented industrial strategy, and I had really great commissioners. And then I invited Brian Eno, a famous music producer, to one of the meetings, because he's on my board of the Institute. And at one point he's like, hold on a second, my God, on the one hand, he said, you guys are just, incredibly inspirational. You're talking about things that are, fantastically relevant. But he said, but you're sometimes making assumptions, which is, why do you always assume that people want to get from point A to point B quicker? What if they just actually want to go slower and experience life and have the time and to just live in a different way? So a bit of that, one could say, okay, fine, whatever. Actually, people really need to get places quickly, and congested traffic is terrible. But how we reimagine with musicians, with poets, with the full breadth of the humanities, and people, just tackling and thinking about these problems differently. That's also part of that co-creation, co-design. It's not just about citizen movements and trade unions, as I was talking about before. Academia itself has become a bit too focused on some subjects, and we're also underfinancing, the humanities. You'll have lots of physics and mathematics and economics departments potentially doing just fine, and then we just think that's because that's good for the economy. And yet, if the inspiration has to come from this broader set of voices, we also need to be asking ourselves, what does that mean for opening ourselves or ears to other ways of thinking about the world?
So I was talking to the journalist David Wallace Wells yesterday, and I'm author of Uninhabitable Earth, and I mentioned that I was talking to you, and I asked him if would he be interested to hear from you, and he had a great question. He was curious about your thoughts on the new dogma of central banks and what it would take for central banks to embrace climate change as a mission.
So first of all, that's sort of happening. I mean, in Europe, at least, the European Central Bank and the European Investment Bank are having an increasing number of conversations about climate finance, but also making sure that, especially in a moment like this, like the health pandemic or previously with the financial crisis, we don't just flood the system with liquidity, which is what happened with the financial crisis. Most of that money just went back into the financial sector. It didn't actually resolve the problems on the ground. So this kind of much needed coordination between injection of money and then the actual structures in the real economy that need that money, but also with a direction. So it's not just, stuff in the real economy, but again, in order to foster green transition. I think those conversations are very much there. The need to have an independent, central bank. Of course, that's always the pushback, which is no, what you need is, say, directed fiscal policy, fine, but you can't have a central bank directing where the money goes. That's where, but they do direct it in the end. I mean, there's particular, places where this increased liquidity goes, and even just making that much more visible, transparent, and having metrics that are mandatory for different banks and investors to reach, as opposed to just the kind of voluntary ESG kinds of metrics. I think that's one of the main ways, which is to get a financial system broadly defined, not just central banks, where finance is being directed towards areas that truly are sustainable, and that we have standardized, transparent, mandatory metrics in order to capture that sustainability or not sustainability of the system. That itself would go a long way. I think Mark Carney with the Bank of England has been very important for those discussions.
So it's about, so you're saying the central banks, and they're setting a direction. Maybe they are setting more of a direction than they maybe have in the past. And that, I mean, obviously the climate is in the conversation. If we think about, the stimulus 10 years ago in the US was $700 billion, and the most controversial thing ever. Now we have like $6 trillion in stimulus, I believe, in the past year in the US alone. And there's a small amount of grumbling, but not much. What is the difference? And I feel like your ideas are being embraced, right? That you felt compelled to write this book, and now that's on the table. What's different now? Why is that happening? And will this last long enough to do the things that we need to do?
So in one of the chapters where I talk about outcomes-based financing, I kind of recall one of the main points of MMT, modern monetary theory, and my friend Stephanie Kelton, who's also on my board, is one of the key advocates of that. Sometimes I think they exaggerate because they forget to also narrate it in such a way that politicians can also talk about it without getting massive amounts of pushback. But the key point is so right, which is when we go to war, no one says, "Oh, we don't have enough money." Money literally comes out of the woodwork. Right? Has anyone ever said, "Oh, we can't go to Afghanistan. Oh, we can't go to Korea. We can't fight World War II because there's not enough tax revenue"? Money is created, right? The problem is that it's also created when you have a financial crisis, when we have COVID and the kind of recovery schemes that we need now. But often that's too late. You actually have to wait for the war to arrive, for climate change to get to the point that it is getting, and it hasn't even gotten to that. Like, we're not spending the trillions on climate change yet. We are, with the COVID recovery scheme, all of a sudden, putting in a lot of money, but it's too late. What does it mean to be creating that money in such a way that along the way you are preventing these crises or making our social fabric more resilient, our systems less unequal. Because, of course, with COVID, we know that the people who've been affected the most are those also who've been suffering the most in terms of increased inequality, global capitalism. So why don't we create funds to solve those problems along the way, precisely so then you don't have to put in the trillions all of a sudden overnight, which potentially is, I don't want to say a waste of money. I believe that we should have even bolder stimulus packages, but it becomes very hard to do it in a strategic, structured way if it's kind of, again, too little too late. And so I think what we really need is a different idea of where money comes from, what is the real constraint in the in a government's budget, and the whole fear of inflation, for example, doesn't make any sense if you are operating at under capacity, right? When you have the levels of unemployment we do, or underutilized resources, or wrongly utilized resources. So a major transformation of those resources, which again expand the pie because you're transforming the system in a new direction. There's no reason you should have inflation. You have inflation when an economy is stagnant and you're not increasing its potential growth rate, and then you just inject a lot of money. You literally have an existing amount of goods and services with a lot of new money kind of sticking on it. That'll increase inflation. But if you're expanding the pie, you won't. But the problem is, if we're just expanding in this unsustainable way that kills the planet, then that's a whole other problem, which inflation is a minor problem if we're, all going to be, no longer on a sustainable planet. So I just think that what the COVID recovery, trillions that are being put into the system remind us is actually when we care and when we realize, we've got to act now because lives are on the line and jobs, then we actually do come in. But unless it's part of a new way of thinking of what government is for, what the constraints are, and what is public finance, then it actually doesn't create a real shift. We're just going to go back to normal later, wait for the next crisis, and again, put in the trillions without having actually changed the underlying structure.
So there was a great tweet triptych of you and Kate Rayworth and Stephanie Kelton holding each other's books.
Oh, yeah.
And the three of you, have pushed the consensus on economics, the purpose of the state, assumptions about money in huge ways. I'd say Carlota Perez and Elizabeth Anderson are also two people who changed that. So why are your ideas connecting to this moment?
You mean our ideas, the triptych?
Our, yes, by your, I mean all this.
Yeah. Good. Well, it's funny because Stephanie and I once joked around about, how the Financial Times has this magazine that's called How to Spend It. We said, well, we should write that. And it'll be like, Stephanie will tell you, how, where money comes from. And Mariana will tell you what, in terms of the missions and the purpose. We're like, we'll be the editors of that magazine. How and what to spend on. And of course, Kate's work has been really important for also making this notion of the circular economy something also very visual. That wonderful donut she has, which is really about how do we think about the regenerative potential about the economy, but also of humans as needing to regenerate their own ability to prosper. So I think they're important, these three ideas. And these three different ways, in some ways, of saying similar things, but with different focuses, because our system is so not going in that direction. We continue, even now where we're putting all this money in, we're already hearing about the need to share the burden and to cut public spending later. So the idea of austerity and governments being seen as the same thing as a family household that has to be living within its means, all that kind of problematic notion because it's theoretically unfounded, which again we always realize when it's too late. That's still there. This idea that at best we should just be putting a lot of money into infrastructure because interest rates are low, that's still there. And the idea that actually all the wealth creation is in business, and at best we can talk about stakeholder value as a way to feel good because you're sharing your great individually created wealth in a better way. That's still there. There's no proper kind of collective value creation. So to create change, I think we need the battle to be a triptych one in that way that you just said. By the way, that photo came about one evening. I think I don't know, eating ice cream or something with the kids. And Kate sent me and Stephanie a WhatsApp, and we had never been on WhatsApp together, saying, "Hey guys, I just got a great idea. Can you please go take a picture of yourself with with the other two's books?" And luckily, we had those books. There was this assumption that we'd all have each other's books. We did, and then we all had to have our kids take these photos because it's quite difficult to sit there. So my kids were like, "Nah, you don't look good. Go back." And then it was just like done in 10 minutes, and then it became a great little Twitter, whatever. What are they called? Not meme, something. Twitter, something. Yeah, and by the way, I've never seen guys do that. I've never seen guys. You know what I thought was what I liked about that? Women supporting women and showing each other's work. So we weren't holding our own book, but each other's. I thought there was something really special there because unfortunately, definitely in academia, that's not how, everyone's worried about their own citation index, H factor.
No, I think that's a great point. I don't know if three men would have done that. I don't know if they would. I think that's fair. I think that's fair. If I could squeeze in just one last thing, if I have this correct, you write about how much money Deloitte and the big consulting firms make from government and the ways the government has outsourced stuff. But it's my understanding that you don't get paid for the work that you do with governments. Is that true? And why not?
Well, so first of all, I've been criticizing the large consulting companies for a process that I've been witnessing, which is the reduction in government's own investment in their capabilities, right? So that infantilization that Lord Agnew talks about of the public sector, which I think is, again, a really interesting way to put the problem, is what then my advice to governments is focused on. A lot of my work is free. Almost all the advisory councils I'm on are free. So I'm an advisor. I was a special advisor to the Italian Prime Minister, to the South African President, and to the Scottish First Minister. That's free. I also, when I bring my institute to the table, we need to fund the work, right? So the postdocs, the PhD students that will be part of a team that over a 2-year period will work hand in hand with the civil servants. We have contracts for very little. They basically cover the costs, say, of a postdoc. So, for example, for the 2-year work we did in Scotland, the cost charge mainly covered my collaborator, who was a research fellow, to do the work. So it's basically at cost. I am on the speaker circuit. I won't, I am an academic on an academic salary with an artist husband, 4 kids, in a very expensive, European city. So I do need to make extra money, and I tend to do that more in talking about my work. And it's nice to be paid to talk about ideas, but that's not really consulting. That's what is that, after dinner talk payments? But yeah, but I actually, yeah, but it's also what you're charging. So if people are charging governments, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Actually, I think it would be wrong to think that an academic who, is just going to go around doing free work. The problem with consulting companies is the amount that they're charging. It's extraordinary in terms of the billions often being siphoned out of government budgets. But even there, it would be okay, actually, if that was accompanied by an intra-governmental investment, which over time weaned you off of that need to get the consulting companies to, for example, do project management. So I don't actually blame the consulting companies. I blame governments for becoming addicted to them. There's a big debate happening now in Italy with Mario Draghi, who's brought in McKinsey to basically project manage the recovery. Now, if that's because in the meantime the Italian civil service has become decimated, then maybe he has no choice. But if that's a process of increasing the decimation of the Italian civil service, that's the problem. And I think, unfortunately, that's where we are. This is over consultification.
Well, you've been so generous with your time, Mariana. I so appreciate it, and the book is great, and your mission is as important as any in the world, and I continue to wish you success.
Thank you so much, Yancy. And I hope one day we can collaborate on something together, especially in the woods behind you. Thanks for the discussion, and hope to talk soon.